Welcome to the Behind the Bits podcast. Your host, Scott Curtis, wants to learn everything he can about stand-up comedy and take you along for the ride. Scott and his guests talk serious about comedy in every episode. Behind the Bits will uncover knowledge from different perspectives on subjects such as writing and performing stand-up comedy, as well as booking shows and the comedy life. If you're thinking about becoming a stand-up comic, already in the comic game, or a comedy nerd, Behind the Bits is the show for you. Now, let's get Behind the Bits.
Hey, BTB buddies. The BTB Internet Talk Show is back this Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on the Drinks, Jokes, and Storytelling Twitch channel. Hey, don't be afraid of Twitch. It's a great interactive way to watch cool shows like mine. That's right, you can write comments during the show and we will respond. This week we have the very funny Holly Ballantyne, the also very funny Joel Brill, and the funny host of the funny science fiction podcast, Tim Biesiegel. Head over to the Drinks, Jokes, and Storytelling Twitch channel through the link in the show notes and click that follow button so you can watch all the great programming they have 7 days a week. It's free, it's fun, and it's weird. Hey, BTB buddies, I want to talk to you about Thousand Fell. Thousand Fell is shoes, but not shoes like you buy, wear out, and throw away so they can spend a few thousand years in a landfill. Thousand Fell is full circle footwear. What is full circle footwear, you ask? It's footwear designed from innovative, leatherless materials, which is backed by Thousand Fell's brand-owned recycling program, which guarantees their sneakers will never end up in a landfill. How's that for you? These sneakers do good, feel good, and look good at the same time. Vogue said these sneakers bring both a cool factor and practicality. Thousand Fell sneakers are 100% leatherless, 100% recyclable, 100% vegan, zero waste, stain and water resistant, odor repellent, and blister proof. What more can you want from shoes? Head over to thousandfell.com and check out the Color Drop collection and make sure you claim your 10% first customer discount on these great sneakers. When you check out, tell the cool people at Thousand Fell that Behind the Bits sent you. They're good ones. All right, I think we're live on Twitch. So today, I'm pretty stoked. Met this guy through podcasting. Anthony Jeannot is a critically acclaimed stand-up comedian who sold out shows in Australia, England, Scotland, Sweden, and more. In 2020, Anthony released his debut stand-up comedy album. Guess what? It's called Stand-Up Comedy Album. Easy to find on Spotify, I'll tell you that. And he's recently started a podcast I want to talk about called the Highbrow Drivel Podcast. Anthony, how you doing?
I'm doing well, man. How are you? I'm excited to chat to you.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I am talking to more people from the United Kingdom and Australia than I am United States people lately. So it's really neat because you guys you're different. And I want to get into that a little bit because what you do, the way you are able to add to your comedy, the storytelling part, United States audiences are not as forgiving of that kind of stuff. They want set up punch. And I really enjoyed your album because I was able to relax and get into the story. So that's one of the things I want to talk about. But first, I think you've been doing comedy for about 10 years, right?
Yeah. I will say there was a couple years that I took out. So I think when I started comedy, I did read the same books as everybody usually reads and you know, got the same advice of everyone that you want to laugh every 15, 20 seconds if you've really got a great joke sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I started comedy trying to write jokes like that. Mm-hmm. And again, the classic wisdom, hone your 5, work your 5. And I did the same 5 of like really short, sharp jokes for about 2 years. And you know, it wasn't terrible. I won a competition that, you know, had some really big names. Ronnie Chang was in that. Like we sort of started out together. Our first three my first 3 gigs were competitions that he was also in. He won one, another guy won one, I won one. And then what happened was I couldn't replicate that. I didn't find that funny. And so I just stopped having fun on stage. And so then I took a couple years off and then came back and did what has evolved into what I do now.
Right. And it's funny, almost everybody starts out with the rapid fire, the one-liners or the two-liners and maybe 3 tags. And I think everybody has to do it. It's almost like your comedy basic training or something like that. And you're developing your stage presence and stuff like that all at the same time. But I, like you, am the same way. I have to tell stories. I'm talking about my real life, and I have to give a little bit of background, and I'm not going to get a laugh every 15 seconds. But when I get to it, I want it to be good. And like from your album, it was good. So I really enjoyed the fact that I could listen to somebody that puts a little bit of exposition into their act, and we don't get it as much over here.
Thanks. I enjoy that. I do think, because I have thought about this a lot, because even coming from Australia to the UK, I had to punch up even the version that you get now is, I think, the reason I put the album out was because the UK made me a better comic, because this goes really well over here, that style of comedy.
Yeah.
But I had to punch it up because I think in Australia, one of the things is that because the scene is so small and your opportunities for stage time are so little, but then we have this massive comedy festival. To get stage time, what you need to do is do an hour before you have 15 minutes worth of jokes, right?
Yeah.
And so often, most of us, what we'll do is go, well, we can't tell shit jokes for 45 minutes.
Right.
So let's develop the story around it, be interesting till we get to the joke, and use the jokes as a way to keep people listening to not feel like they were ripped off because you told 15 minutes of jokes in an hour, right?
Right.
And so you have to develop storytelling as a tangential skill to build those shows before you're actually ready. Because really, you shouldn't be charging people money to listen to you for an hour when you've got 15 minutes worth of jokes unless you develop something else around it. So I think that's what happens is we get used to doing these hour-long shows. And then in the background, we've got to learn then, okay, how do I take what I'm doing here and punch it all up to get it so that I can perform in a club where, like at Fringe, one of the gigs I did, because I had at Edinburgh Fringe, I had an 11:30 p.m. slot in like one of the boozy hubs, and in a 20-seater room, and one of the nights every single person there was a bucks party, right? And you've listened to the story show, it's the exact opposite of my ideal crowd. But you have to coming from Australia, you kind of have to reverse engineer that, as opposed to, I think, most of the world where you have to learn how to come in hot and manage a crowd and build these really punchy jokes and then earn the right to talk for a longer time, which is probably the correct way to do it in a lot of respects. We just do it a bit backwards. I guess it's what happens when you're on the opposite side of the world.
Yeah, and the funny thing is storytelling is starting to become more popular over here. However, they're not associating the storytelling with the comedy so much. It's usually pretty serious stuff. And the funny thing is right before the pandemic, the last thing I did was a storytelling night at a winery, and it was really fun because I put a lot of good tags in there, and people laughed all the way through. And I told a story that I had never talked about before, and it gave me material to put into an actual act. So I really enjoy storytelling, and I just think our attention spans really need to get a little bit longer and be able to just be patient, and we know the punch is going to come. We know it's going to be funny. Just let it go, But that's not us Americans. We're not like that.
Although to be fair, it is, again, it's a lot of places in the world. Like I have definitely done gigs that went well, by the way. Like, no, it wasn't that the gigs went poorly. And I've had people come up on stage and say things like, "Oh, you were really good, but that's not comedy." And I was like, did they laugh? Yes, that's comedy. I had a guy at Fringe who came to one of my shows, and then at the bar afterwards, a comic who I get along quite well with, and he said something along the lines of, and it's like a classic backhanded compliment. He's like, "You are going to want to, if you ever go to the US, you're going to want to be really, really good, because you can't perform in clubs, you have to perform in theaters." And it's like, well, you know, and it is interesting that there is this mental dichotomy in that one of these things belong in theater and one of these things belong in clubs. It's also interesting that comics would claim that clubs are the high ground. Like, if I have to pick one of them, I'm doing the theaters.
Oh, yeah. Right? Yeah, no doubt. And I think the difference in audience is also, you know, I've performed enough to know that people over here absolutely do not do any research on the comedian that they're going to go see. I mean, a lot of them are my age. They are on their one night out every 6 months, and they're going to a comedy club, and you know, their sensibilities are not ready for what they're about to hear most of the time. I mean, you know, they're not ready for dick jokes, eating ass, all the stuff that our young comedians are doing right now. And then they get pissed off and they don't go to another show. But if they just do a little research and say, hey, you know, this one's not for me, but next week it looks like, Scott Curtis, the old guy, is going to be up there doing his clean stuff, and you know, but we don't do that. And I think over there, I think your audiences know what they're going to go see most of the time, even if it is a club. Is that right?
I would say kind of. I would say what clubs are quite good at doing is building a lineup around the headliner a bit.
Yeah.
And so. I think I would not say it's always great, though, and particularly I'm being very London centric here, right? Like the minute you get out of London, there are a bunch of gigs that kind of happen maybe once a month, and the organizer's been running it forever and probably hasn't seen 90% of the acts that he's booking, and is purely going on feedback from the person who booked, which is super subjective. And so there are, like, again, I've done gigs where I've walked in and it is quite literally like an 80-seat community center, and every single person knows each other by name. And it's like, oh, actually, if you were booking the best comedian for this gig, it's not me. Like, I can make it work, but there are people who are, because if everybody knows each other by name, what you want is someone who's going to be interactive. Yeah. And by the end of the show, he knows them all by name, right? And I didn't get into stand-up comedy to talk to a neighbor. Like, that's not what I'm here to do, you know? I don't want to know your name. I've got something to say, you know?
Yeah. I like that. And one of the things I noticed, because I watched some of your video too, is you seem very comfortable on stage. Did you ever have stage fright, or are you just one of those people that don't really have it?
No, I did, and particularly when I was doing the short jokes, which felt unnatural to me and I didn't quite trust as much. It's definitely been a lot of learning, because what I've increasingly realized is a lot of what I funnel into comedy is just general kind of anxiousness around the edges, and that's where I find the funny. And so when I took the decision to try and do stuff that I enjoyed talking about, then all of a sudden, that nervousness is there, but it's the same level of nervousness I have talking to anyone at any time. So it's just like a constant.
Right.
And then on top of that, just the more you do the jokes, and particularly as somebody who can be divisive for audiences, the more you see, you go, okay, I know that maybe tonight I've really had to work hard, and where the laughs came from were not my jokes, they're stagecraft, and what I've learned how to eke out and grind out a draw instead of getting a unanimous decision win, right? I'm really hustling for the bell here.
Yeah.
And you do that enough times and you go, okay, that's one. And then you do 9 other gigs that go well. And you go, okay, so it's just, it's just not for everybody. And you've got to learn to develop skills separate to what you enjoy doing.
Right.
But what you enjoy doing does work. You just need to be performing it to the people who want to see that.
Yeah. Yeah. When did you get the idea of being a comic? Was this something that you grew up wanting to do, or was it something that came later on?
So the actual decision to try it was in my 20s, but the love of stand-up comedy is, I feel like this is a super cliche kind of way to get into comedy, but I had a sick day and like going through my parents' VCR collection and I found Eddie Murphy Delirious, and it blew my goddamn mind that he was a rock star and he was saying all the kind of things that I was saying to my friends, which we couldn't say now and shouldn't say now, but at the time, that's how that's how we interacted with each other. I thought it was hilarious. And I wanted to be Eddie Murphy so bad, right? And then I fell in love with comedy. And so I went to local gigs. And like I said, we've got a big festival. And so from the time I was about 14, I was just like, getting my dad to take me into the city so I could see the shows that didn't have age limits and stuff. But it wasn't until I was about 21 and I saw, so it's interesting because most people get into comedy because they see somebody like Eddie Murphy who inspires them so much that they go, I need to do that.
Yeah.
I was the opposite. It wasn't until I saw someone who was so bad that I was like, no matter what I do on stage, I am not the worst thing to happen to comedy. And so that's what kind of empowered me to go, I'll give it a crack then.
Yeah. It's really funny that you say that because when I was doing my first open mics, my wife's very frank with me and tells me when I eat shit and when I do well. And I would take her quite a bit. And I felt I was totally fine with it because I'd run my bits by her. But the only question I ever asked at the end of the open mic was I the worst? And, she'd be totally honest. And I was never the worst because, there's going to be somebody that just is awful and it's their first time and their last time. You're never going to see them again. But, I started moving up to middle of the pack and then got a little bit better. And then I didn't need her anymore. So she, I could just go do my thing on my own.
Yeah. It is a natural defense mechanism, I reckon, to just be like, I don't want to be the weakest link in the pack. Like it's genuinely a pack mentality. Yep. I don't want to be the one that they cull at the end of Survivor.
Yeah. Yeah. So thinking about you talk about in the album, you talk about your real jobs and how you're in advertising, marketing, social media, and stuff like that, which is absolutely mind-numbing because I know I have to do my own social media for my stuff, and I just go so sick of looking at it. Have you gotten any material that is just directly? I heard a couple on the album, but does a lot of your material just come from the stuff that you have to write up for these clients?
Oh, absolutely. Because there's two things about it. One is that it is mind-numbing and boredom is great for creativity, right?
Yeah,
the more bored you are, the more you have to entertain yourself. And then the second is that the job is absurd, right? Like I've had to pretend to be a tool company for way too much money. And all of it is ridiculous. And the more you can see the absurd in it, the more you're like, hey, right now I am a fully grown adult talking to a 16-year-old college dropout because he bought a tool that he could barely afford to do things with real skills that I don't have.
Yeah.
And he's got to talk to me who's getting way too much money for this conversation.
Yeah.
The more you go, your brain starts to play with these things. And then the third thing, the real gift from a creative standpoint of working in social media is it means that I get to be on social media at all times. So I'm abreast with the news. And I'm not a topical comedian at all.
Yeah.
But what I am good at is going, how does this thing in my life interact with this conversation that people seem to want to have?
Right.
And so it's not going to catch me by surprise, you know, that
right.
people are worried about housing affordability or whatever the topic of conversation is.
Yeah.
If I can fold it into the material, I will, because I'm constantly on social media, which is a great thing for comedians.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it is. And the bit you did with the two pictures of Rihanna and that's advertising, you know. It's so funny.
I mean, it is absolutely ridiculous as well, because I started in the industry at a time where, like, most of my managers, creative directors, these people were writing TV ads, right? They were huge budgets, 30-second TV ads with bunches of billboards and all this stuff around them. And that was still part of my job. It was still a small part of my job. But most of the brands wanted to funnel it into tweets. And so you have these 50-year-old people who think in terms of these grand TV ads, trying to come down to 140 characters, and then they get their idea into 140 characters, and the brands go, no, you've got to cut out 20 because we need 20 emojis at the end. It's ridiculous.
Oh, man, that's nuts. It's funny. One of my best social media mediums is Instagram, and it was starting to wane. It wasn't doing as well. And I started posting these memes where I'm kind of just shitting on my own podcast. And I've got one with a guy eating ice cream by himself, and it says celebrating my 1-year anniversary with all my fans, you know, and I just keep churning those out. And it's funny. It's totally blowing things up, at least for now. I know that's going to go away too, but you know, it's kind of fun to mess around with the algorithm a little bit and get some new people interacting with you. But that's about where the fun ends. It's really making the memes. That's not fun.
Yeah. And to be fair, the fun thing, if you can get it to work, is that if you can be quite meta with the form, like you are doing with the meme, and then being quite self-deprecating, the algorithm often likes that. Yeah. Still to this day, my most popular post about my podcast was when I announced that I was starting it, and it was just like the middle-class white comedian podcast starter pack, and then it was like a photo of my man bun, so it was like man bun. It had, you know, what's his face, the rapper who I'm gonna pop it'll come to me, the thrift guy anyway. Okay, but it was just like middle-class topics, and in jokes, and then it was like Steve Carell, like, in jokes, when can I be in on this? Like, and that is, like, you know, that is a lot of comedy podcasts. Yeah, and it is the sort of thing where people go, we see what you're doing. You are like that. Good on you. We'll throw you a like. Yeah.
It's weird how that works, but I guess that's the game. That's what we have to play. Thinking about the album. Obviously, you said at the top of it that you recorded 2 sets and put all that together. What was your end game? What did you want to accomplish by putting the album out?
So, you know what? 50% of it was just that. I had performed 4 solo shows in Australia, and then I moved to the UK for a year, and I got double as good as a comic just because they beat the nonsense out of me. Yeah. Like you know, even as you said today, I'm still quite a rambly storytelling comic. I was worse when I was in Australia, and partly because nobody cared that I wasn't, and I didn't realize I needed to punch up until I got to the UK. And then I felt like it was unfair that all these people who'd come and seen me for years were then like not missing out. That's super self-indulgent, but just, I've been lying to you because I thought that was the best I could do. Yeah. But actually, here's this bit better. That it's like, you know, when you break up with your girlfriend and then you lose weight. It felt a bit like that. That I'd gone away and got better, And
so, this is what you wanted.
Yeah, exactly. Here you go. That thing I said I couldn't do, guess what, I can. And so I was in Australia for actually for my sister's wedding. I wasn't going to do shows, but then I thought I really wanted to put the show on, and I'd just done it at Edinburgh. Like, I just finished my run, and I just thought, oh, well, you know I can sell this show well, and I don't know, like, I don't know if the material gets better, and I don't know if I want to keep doing it as a show anymore. And so why not just fill out a room a couple of times, record it, and put it out. And at the time, because I put it out, I recorded it at the end of October 2019, and it was released in May 2020. At the time, I had thought that releasing the album would inspire me to not tell those jokes anymore on stage. As it turns out, I have not told those jokes anymore on stage.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I can see that. Yeah, it's kind of hard to get on stage these days, but exactly. And I just don't know if you can throw out Doomsday Prepper. That is so hilarious, and I actually had to listen to it through twice. And the part where you're like, oh, she's got land, and that little subtle thing right there just got me so much.
Yeah, so I think that is my favorite line in that bit too, purely because it is a classic bait and switch, where it is a ridiculous emotional situation and you go to the absurd for a moment, and particularly because it's a little bit out of character for me as a comic, it really does blindside people. And I do, as a comic, it's always good when you can catch people by surprise, particularly because that joke comes 45 minutes into the show, right? Yeah. It's interesting because I haven't been on stage really since I released the album. I've had a lot of time to think about, like, what do I do? Because I don't feel comfortable starting to do new gear after having not done comedy for 2 years. It feels like learning how to walk again and signing yourself up for a marathon on the first day, you know? And so I've been really starting to think about, how do I breathe new life into something old just as a way to get out there with training wheels again? And so I think the Doomsday Prepper is the perfect bit, because I get to talk about the fact that the last time I was on stage, I could tell this joke about the Doomsday Prepper, and she was the idiot. Yeah. And now, 12 months later, look who's laughing. Yeah. Right?
Oh, she's all stocked up and ready to go.
Exactly. And so I think it's a nice entry into, like, still being able to do the joke and get all of the laughs that it used to get, but also just adding new stuff about the way the world has changed. So yeah, I think that is going to be my approach to getting back out in the world when stages open up.
That's great. Now, we talked a little bit before we started recording about virtual comedy and how you tried it and didn't like it. Because I talked to quite a few people in this last year that are either leaning hard into it or can't do it all. And there's a few people like me in the middle. I'll jump in like once in a while, but I just feel like, I don't know. I feel like I got stood up for a date afterwards or something. It just doesn't feel right. But you experienced at least a couple of them. What do you think you would do it again if you absolutely had to?
No, and I think starting the podcast was my answer to what do I do without comedy. I think for me, the problem with virtual gigs is, at least at the time I was doing them, and they may have evolved over the last 12 months. I hope they have. But at the time I was doing them, most gigs would either have the audience all with their sound on, and then some idiot talks to his wife, hey, can you get me a beer while you're up? And then all of a sudden the house of cards you've delicately built to get to your punchline ends with, can you get a beer? And you've got to try and start all that again. And it's just, comedy is hard enough, right? Comedy is hard enough when you are in a room and it's dark for everybody. They can't see each other and you're amplified, right?
Yeah.
Competing with the TV and the cat and everybody can see each other and scroll. Like, for me, I mean, I'm not that good at comic. I don't think I am, right? And then, so there was a period where I did my first one and I was like, oh, I don't know about this. Then I did my second one and they did the opposite. Everybody was silent the whole time. So, and for me, that is torture. Like, I believe in Edinburgh, they do a gig where the whole joke is that the comedian has earmuffs and is blindfolded, so cannot tell how the gear is going.
Yeah. And
I've heard stories of like proper headliners doing that gig and coming off stage and crying, right?
Oh, yeah.
And if that's like the best, like, it's torturous.
Yeah.
And if that's the best people, then again, I don't want to compete with that. And particularly as we've discussed, like, I like to tell stories. I like to be vulnerable on stage. If you do that and you don't get the reward of the laughter, the validation of the laughter, as much as it shouldn't be about, but if you don't get that, like you said, it feels a bit like you stood up on prom night. You just feel super like hollow, like, and I hated that feeling. Yeah. And I was like, okay, so there's two things you can do now. You can think of another way to do comedy that fits a virtual environment. And I tweet around with like, okay, maybe I've got to be really absurd. Maybe I've got to use slides, blah, blah. And then I'm learning skills that don't transfer back into stage and or maybe they do. I don't know. But it felt like a lot of effort for also at the time. I thought for a short time, like I didn't realize we'd still be doing this shit today. I thought, I'm going to learn all these new skills. And then 2 months later, I'm going to get back on stage and be like, what was that for?
Yeah.
As it turns out, probably could have evolved a bit. But yeah, I just, for me, the emotional exchange was all out of whack. It felt like, it felt like, as you said, it felt like being stood up on a date you didn't even want to go on. Like your friend asked you to take his little sister out to give her a confidence boost.
Right.
And then you rock up and you're wearing a suit because he's asked you to do that too. And then she doesn't turn up. And
like, she doesn't want you. Yeah. Yeah, I totally get it. And what we do, the reason why we do it is for the feedback. And there is this two-dimensional conversation we're having here is great. I'm super stoked that I can do it. I'm really glad that I can talk to you over in Europe. I'm here. We're having a great conversation, but it does not take the place of you and I sitting in a bar having a beer together. It absolutely does not. And comedy is the same way. It's totally fine if you're leaning into it and you love it. However, you got to think about, I do believe that some of this stuff's going to stay. One of the things I do like is the open mics because you can jump in there, not know anybody, say your 5 minutes out loud, and it's like on Facebook Live or something, you can rewatch it and find out to you what's funny and what's not. So I do enjoy that part, and I'll jump in on one when I've got some new material, and my expectations are nothing. And if I get a laugh, that's fine. If I don't get a laugh, that's fine. I usually sign off as soon as I'm done, and don't watch anybody else. Just like a real open mic. And that's I do see some. I see some benefit to that, and some of these comics are putting on big paid shows. Birbiglia is doing it really well, and Steve Hofstetter is doing it really well, and I think they're going to continue to do it because you know what, it's a lot cheaper to do that than fly around and do 6 shows in a week or whatever. So, it is what it is. And I think some people are going to adapt to it. And the ones that don't are going to finally, after everybody gets vaccinated, be able to get out and do it for real again.
I think one part of it that will stay and evolve is I think touring to smaller parts of the town, of a town, a neighboring town, is almost going to become obsolete, because what people will do is they'll gig on the time zone and they'll gig in the major cities, and rather than going to the neighboring one while you're in that town and on that time zone, have a virtual ticket that you can buy to the, rather than doing Berlin and Hamburg. I'm sure people from Hamburg are going to be really annoyed that I've rolled them into small town territory. But rather than doing that, you do your capital, and then everywhere else you can either come virtually or not. But the gift that will have is, for the performer, you're still getting the live engagement, and even for the audience, you are getting you're pretty much getting a live Netflix special, which is actually super cool, because it adds to some of that uniqueness and to some of that immediacy that you lose in a recorded special. Right. And so, I think that will be really cool.
Yeah. And you did exactly what a lot of people did during the pandemic and started the podcast. And I really enjoy the format, and the subject matter, especially those last couple that I listened to, is just really great. So how did you come up with the idea? It's Highbrow Drivel. How did you come up with the idea for that?
So I guess it's one of those things, right, where as a comic, every other comic had started a podcast 5 years ago, and everyone had sort of had a crack. And it was something that I did at first make fun of. I was a snobby purist. I was the equivalent of the person who told me I should be on theater. Yep. I didn't want to. And then I realized that I wanted to do something that still kept me engaged, like those parts of my brain, like how do I be funny working? And I didn't want to be two people and a mic and no topic, because those podcasts frustrate the hell out of me. And I didn't want to talk about comedy, because I think there's so many good comedy podcasts out there, and I didn't feel like I had anything to add to the conversation, although clearly I guess I do now.
Yeah, you do.
But I wanted something like what can I do that is interesting and different? And I realized one of the things I've always kind of been in the group, if I had to be a guy, was like the curious guy. I was always like, pulling things apart and trying to figure out why they work the way they do. Like, instead of being like, hey, change the channel, I'd be like, yeah, but how does it work? And like pulling it apart. And I don't like tinkering with my hands, but I do like understanding the kind of mechanics behind the way things interact and things are the way they are. Yeah. So I was like, I think there is a lot of really cool information about this stuff that is hidden behind academia, because academia is boring and written for wankers, right? Yeah. And so I was like, well, there's that information there, and I've got these funny friends who are interesting to listen to. If I bring these two things together, hopefully what we get is this information in a way that is interesting as it should be for everyone, but accessible and doesn't feel like a TED Talk.
It's funny. I'm guessing that this has evolved into something more than you expected, because you call it like lighthearted and funny all the time, but you've got some banter at the beginning with your one of your guests, and you bring the expert out, and you guys have gotten into some pretty good sized debate, and it's not necessarily funny, but it's interesting. I mean, the billionaire one, the last one that came out, that one, I told you I learned a lot from that, because I hadn't thought of how billionaires are really, they're monopolizing their industry, and the cash obviously doesn't go down to the workers, and it also stifles creativity, because nobody wants to get into it anymore.
Yeah, it did. It evolved quite quickly. And part of that was at the time that proper elected MPs started saying yes to me, because, I was putting out these, hey, do you want to be on my podcast, as absolute Hail Marys. And for the people who said yes, I was like, oh, now I've got to figure out how to have a conversation with, Lloyd Russell Moyle, the guy on that most recent episode, he is like the biggest advocate for halting UK arms trades to the Middle East. He's somebody who, from a political level, I'm so interested in. And now I've got to have a conversation with you and try and be funny.
Yeah.
It's a lot. I think every episode really, it is the dynamic of having two guests and a different subject matter, is that every episode is kind of different in how much weight the interesting takes to the comedy. Like I've got an episode coming up about dinosaurs, which I thought would get quite dry because dinosaurs can be quite nerdy. And we barely talk about dinosaurs, but there's some information within. It really depends on the dynamics in the conversation at the time. And I think I like that, and I hope the audience do too, because what I think is if the expert is giving really good, easy to understand answers and me and the other comedian aren't getting bored, then it would feel facetious to start derailing it with dick jokes. It just needs enough humor to keep the thing going, right? But also, if you can give the information and be hilarious at the same time, that's cool too. And so I think to some extent, every conversation, like in real life, just has its own kind of rhythm and balance. But what I definitely try and avoid is that it's 100%. I'd never want an episode to feel like a TED Talk.
Yeah. And you definitely accomplished that. One of the things that I always say, I think it's very important to recognize that out of all the arts, I think the comedians are the smartest and also the most willing to take in information like you are, because we have to be so outward focused in order to connect with our audience. We listen better, I think, and we take in information better, and we're not always, okay, some of us are, but some making about ourselves, because the conversations you have in the podcast, you're not ever like rolling over these people, these guests. You're asking genuine questions, and you're not doing all the talking, which is, it's a sign of a good podcast. So that's what really intrigued me. I wanted to ask you. You've done enough episodes now. Have you had any episodes where either your mind was blown or your mind was changed?
Yeah. And to be honest, my favorite episode did both of those for me in the one episode, which is we spoke to an astronomer, and I had previously thought that I didn't really care about space. I actually did the episode because one of my friends really likes it, and I was like, kind of cool little thing. I'll talk to an astronomer. You have any questions? And my attitude to space was like, when I was 6, it was cool, but now I've got enough problems here on Earth. I don't really give a shit about that. Yeah. When I figure this stuff out, maybe I'll turn my attention outward, right? Yeah. And the guest we had on was the expert astronomer. Was funnier than some of the comedians, to be honest. She was brilliant at being entertaining and delivering information. And she got into a discussion about whether or not the universe dies in the end and why we don't know and the variables at work. And I had my mind blown, and I've researched so much space stuff since that. Yeah. And it turns out I do care about space. Yeah. I don't. And then even in smaller ways, right? Like I recently recorded, it's not out yet. I think it actually comes out on International Women's Day, an episode about the orgasm gap, which is the cultural phenomenon that women come less than men. Yeah. And it was a conversation that, again, it just surprised me in that I went into it, again, I did my research. And as you said, like as a comic, you kind of like a sponge. Yeah. So I picked up bits and pieces from my friends and stuff. And so I thought I knew what I was going to say. And it's the classic Mike Tyson quote of everybody has a plan until you're punched in the face.
Yeah.
And 30 seconds, or it probably was about 3 minutes into the episode, the comedian asked me, so has a woman ever complained that you didn't make her come enough? And for the rest of the episode, I was a bit like, oh no, I don't know how to have this conversation. I don't know how to facilitate it.
Yeah.
I'm not equipped. I wish I could tap out like something else.
Yeah.
I'll release it as a guest.
That's a tough subject for men.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, not having an orgasm is a tough subject for a woman. So,
Yeah, exactly.
I think we get the easier part.
When it comes to equity. My favorite thing about that whole episode, and to be fair, the comedian told me off for making things awkward, but one of the statistics is that in like normal heteronormative penetrative sex, the gap between how often a man orgasms and a woman orgasms is exactly 69%. I just think that's perfect.
Oh, that's great. We're all 14 again. That's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed what I've listened to, and it's funny when you do a podcast, you get kind of so wrapped up in it that you forget to listen to other podcasts. I'm always glad when one pops by, and I am such an advocate for independent podcasts that I won't even listen to the commercial stuff anymore. I used to love Mark Maron. No, I'm done with it because the independent podcasters are the ones that really care about what they're doing, and they're not necessarily the most polished, at least to start out with, but growing with them, I like catching them at that first episode and just growing with them. And yours definitely, I'm interested in a lot of things like you, but I'm glad that you wrap it up in about an hour, because that's about my attention span on new stuff. If I want to take from that, because the billionaire thing, I went down a Google rabbit hole after that. But if it's something that I'm interested in for an hour and then I'm done with it, that's fine. And it's a different subject every week, so that also is appealing, because I get sometimes my wife really likes the true crime podcast, and the thing that bugs me about them is every episode, half of it is a rehash of the last episode, and there's nothing new brought up. So I like them a little bit, but I'm not gonna say I'm a fan. I like what you do.
Yeah, so I was pretty conscious to avoid the Game of Thrones syndrome, which is somebody goes, hey, you gotta listen to this podcast, it's really cool, and then the person wants to, but then actually they've got to get through 10 hours of intro crap before it even gets good. No, like I wanted every episode to be self-contained, like cool. And then also I'm quite conscious of the fact that, again, part of this podcast is I don't have the skills to have the conversations with these people above the level that they're at. Like, if this goes too much longer, they're going to realize I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. So you tap out when they still think you knew what you were doing.
Yeah, we got to surface crash. Let's get out of here. Stop recording.
So that's one side of it. But then hopefully the other side is exactly what you said, is that we have enough of a conversation. There's enough ideas presented. Sometimes we're all in agreement and that's cool. Other times we're not. And either way, hopefully it's enough that somebody goes, if they are interested in that subject, they go, okay, here are some things I want to look up and build my own opinion around. Mm-hmm. That's cool. And if they're not, hopefully it's entertaining enough that they go, okay, that was that. And now I never have to listen to whatever that subject was again, because I've spent an hour confirming that is not for me.
Yeah. I can't wait you've got one a little bit farther down in the back catalog about dreams, and I can't wait to listen to that, because I've been having some really weird dreams, and the older I get, the more vivid they are, and I wake up and remember them and stuff, and so I can't wait to listen to that one. That's going to be next on my list, I think.
So a funny thing happened in that episode is that I guess as a new podcaster as somebody who was a new podcaster, sorry, you would have had this phenomenon as well, in that, you see the stats on the sheet and there's however many hundred people listening, but for a long time, at least for me, they never interacted with me. And to be fair, there is only one moment in the whole podcast that a bunch of people interacted with me and said, oh my God, I loved that. Uh-huh. And it was in the dreams episode where I asked the dream expert, integrating stuff into your dreams so that you don't wake up. That's kind of a cool phenomenon, but why doesn't our body realize that it shouldn't do that when you need to piss? Like, why did I once piss the bed because I'd integrated it into my dream? And I thought at the very least the comedian would have some jokes about it, or the expert would have something forgiving to say. And quite literally, they both left me hanging. And the dreams expert was like, well, I can't say that happens all that often. And literally my inbox lit up with people going, I can't believe you told them you pissed the bed and they just said that doesn't happen that often.
Oh, I love it. I love it. When you can get shit on your own podcast, that's always the best. It's funny. One of the memes I made, I think I made it this week, was I got two podcasters talking to each other, and I said, okay, are you ready to talk 3.5 hours about 22-minute Seinfeld episode? Because that's what a lot of them are, and I can't even do that. But so yeah, the podcast is great. I know you're on all the apps like I am, and I noticed you're using Podpage like I am, which is absolutely the best way to do a podcast page, because I was messing around with WordPress and Wix and all that stuff. All you got to do is plug it in and you're done, and I like that. Yeah. One of the things I want to get back to comedy a little bit. I like to ask a lot of people that I talk to, what was the best and worst advice you got coming up as a comedian?
The best advice is kind of cliche, and it's a bit of non-advice, but I genuinely think this is true of a new comedian, that you should do this. Listen to everything and ignore just as much.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
You should be interested in the advice that older comics give you. Mm-hmm. You should, even, to be honest, don't expect to be great to begin with. And if anything, like I said, for me personally, not experimenting more in those first couple of years led me to quit, and I nearly never gigged again. So I think when you're early and you don't have an audience, and your whole, the way you learn to perform on stage is so malleable. You're finding your voice so that you don't have a kind of muscle memory of how you process a thing into comedy.
Right.
Experiment as much as you can. Try everything that somebody says. Try it. See if it works. Maybe it works for you. Mm-hmm. And if it doesn't, don't feel like you can't do comedy because you didn't do it the way they said you should. Mm. I think that's the best bit of advice. I think the worst bit of advice was you need to be so good that you sell out theaters, because otherwise nobody's going to want to see you. Which is, to be honest, again, it was a friend, and I think I understand the merit in what they're saying, which is that comedians who do more storytelling style have less middle ground. You're not making a lot of money unless you're really great.
Yeah.
I'm kind of lucky in that I never gave away my day job, and I've kind of slaved pretty hard over both. And so I never need to worry about this being good enough that I make a living off. It is still largely, any money that I get from it is cool, and I'm never going to say no to it, but it is still largely for me a passion project and something that I want to do the way I want to do it. But secondly, I'm not, for all of the criticism around the style of comedy that I do, festivals are hard to make money at. I've never lost money at a festival. That includes accommodation, venue hire, all of that.
Right.
I've always broke even. At Edinburgh, when I was doing a pay what you like show, I mean, I got lucky with the rate of accommodation I paid and that stuff, but I didn't lose money. I've never sunk my own money into a show and not at least made what I spent back. So I think you can fail just as hard trying to do the most conventional form of comedy as you can doing what it is you enjoy. So I do think anybody who says, you know, this is comedy and this is not, is an asshole, to be honest, because the audience will tell you if it's comedy or not by whether or not they laugh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And one of the things that it's funny, I don't know how it is over there, but here it's so competitive. Even if you're in a tiny market like I am, getting feedback from another comic it just doesn't happen because they don't want to tell you if you did well because then you'll keep doing well, and they don't want to tell you if you did poorly because they want you to be up there shitting the bed so that they look better. So it's funny. I've never gotten, at least that's one good thing about the virtual comedy is that you actually do get some good feedback. They'll write you a little note and say, hey, that was really good. Or if they know you well enough, they'll say, hey, you could be better at that one. Your punchline was pretty weak. But, you know, it's funny that here I've never gotten much feedback from my local peeps. And I don't know.
That's interesting because I think in Australia, in particular, the structures are both rigid but massive in such a way that it is almost redundant. You've got like new comics who can only get a gig at a couple of rooms, and then once a month somebody will give them a tryout at a better room. Then you've got this massive conglomerate of people in varying degrees in the middle, and then you've got the people at the top. And I found that the people you make friends with at the bottom, kind of you help each other in the middle. And so even since I've been here for 5 years, I still have a couple of mates who I'm good friends with back home who will send me a recording of a gig and say, what do you think about this punchline? I'm thinking of changing that over there. And equally, you know, when I was going through and doing the show that is out now on Spotify, I genuinely sent a couple of them the script, and I was like, okay, here's word for word the punchline, you know, here's a recording if I've got it. And so, yeah, we do a bit of that, and so it was good in Australia. In the UK, it's a bit harder because it's a bigger scene, so you gig with the same person less often. Yeah. But still, there's a couple of people who, if I got off stage and they were at the gig, you know that you can go, hey, what do you think of that tag? Yeah. Should I do this? Should I do that? Yeah. And I think as much as possible, where that happens, it is so invaluable because otherwise it's a lonely goddamn gig, right? You get off stage and you do well and everybody fucking hates you because you've set the bar too high and you stink it up and they treat you like you're contagious because they don't want the audience to think you're friends with them and think less of them. It's a lonely gig.
Yeah, you just described United States comedy, so that was good. Yeah. The podcast is Highbrow Drivel, and I know you've got a site for that. Where can people find you, and what's your favorite social media to communicate with folks?
I think either Twitter or Instagram. Instagram, I have Highbrow Drivel, the podcast page. Twitter, it's at Anthony Jeannot. So both of those are good for getting responses from me. And genuinely, on both of them, particularly at the moment, I've got nothing better to do, right? Like, even if you've not listened to an episode, even if you want to be like, why haven't you spoken about fucking water shortage in Dubai, or I don't know, whatever weird thing you want to hear about.
Yeah.
Let me know, and I'll probably ignore it, but maybe it's great.
Yeah, you may want to do it, but finding the expert sometimes that's the difficult part. So yeah. I've subscribed to some podcast guest things that people hit me up on, and the quality is varying. I've had a few.
Often terrible.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things, right? Because podcasting's been around for so long, and often there are similarities in comedy in that often the sort of people who start a podcast are people who have a lot to say whose friends don't want to listen to them anymore.
Yeah.
And so they start publishing to avoid and hoping that they find their people, right? And so when I started podcasting to begin with, I was like, I'll join these, guest matchmaking kind of platforms.
Yeah.
And within a week, my inbox was flooded with entrepreneurs and self-help authors and wellness people, right? And so I took to every one of those platforms, said at the top, it said, no, like a no hawkers sign. It was like, no wellness, no entrepreneurs, no self-help.
Yeah.
And still my inbox blew up. And so then I was just like, I just deleted it all, because the temptation to be like, okay, you haven't even read the first line. Why would I put you on? Like, I've been accused of liking the sound of my own voice, and it's something that I'm like, you know what? Probably there's enough evidence to suggest you're right.
Yeah.
But I'm not annoying. Like, I'm not doing the digital thing of knocking on people's door, being like door to door, say, hey, do you want to just listen to me talk for a bit?
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, no doubt. It's funny. I had a publicist that I was working with for a little bit, and he gave me a couple good comics to talk to, but he kept trying to give me psychics, and I'm like, dude, have you listened to my podcast? Because it's a serious talk about stand-up comedy. How does a psychic fit into this? Tell me. And I ended up, what he would do, he would get me on the phone, and then he'd get his clients on the phone, and it would be a 2-hour conversation between me, 3-way call with the client, hang up, next client, and finally he had me on, and it was about an hour and a half, and I finally just looked at the phone and hung up, and then he called me 7 times after that night, and he blew up my Facebook messages, so I had to block him on all platforms, and I'm happy he got me a couple good ones, but it's not worth it. Yeah, it's not worth it.
Scott, do you know the funniest thing about that? The whole time you're telling that story, in my head, I'm just like, also, the psychics can't have been any good, because if they were, they would have known you had no fucking interest.
Yeah. I may use that. I like that. Well, I got to say, it's been really good talking to you, and the podcast is great. Highbrow Drivel is one it's on my list now, and I can't wait to listen to the Dream one and see you get hung out to drive because you're pissed to bed. But it's really neat to understand the different sensibilities, and it's really cool that you're from Australia and you're in the UK now, because there's differences, as you know, there's differences even there, and then coming over here, it's a total difference, and I'm stoked that I got to hear your album and we got to talk.
Yeah, it's been great fun, man. Thanks for getting me on.
Yeah, thanks for being on the show, Anthony.
Cheers.